Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to the show, please hit that subscribe button. Also consider becoming a YouTube member, a Patreon, or donate small amount given in the link in the description box. But let me welcome our guest tonight, Dr. Trita Parsi. Dr. Parsi is an Iranian-born Swedish writer and co-founder and executive vice president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and founder and former president of the National Iranian American Council. Dr. Parsi writes extensively on foreign policy and, among other works, is the author of Treacherous Alliance, The Secret Dealings of Israel, Iran, and the United States. Dr. Parsi, welcome back to India and Global Left.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me again.
Last time we had you on, you said that by December, it was after the June Iran-Israel conflict, you said that by December we can have an Israeli push for war on Iran. We don't really have a war at the moment, but the NBC News has reported that Netanyahu is meeting Trump on Monday to push for an Israeli war on Iran. Can you talk about the reports? What are the updates that we have on that front?
Yeah, as I wrote in my article in August, the logic for Israel to start another war from their standpoint is quite clear because they failed to achieve what they had hoped to achieve, or at least hoped to start to achieve in their first attack, which was they had three objectives. Two of them were failures, one of them succeeded. The one that succeeded was to get the US into the war. But the two others, collapsing the regime and subjugating Iran under Israeli domination, military hegemony, similar to what they have succeeded in doing with Lebanon, with Syria, countries that Israel strikes at will with impunity and without US involvement. But the Israelis failed at that. And if you take a look at it, for almost 2 years, the Israelis had to be dragged to agree to a ceasefire. And even when they agreed to it, they immediately broke it. That's in Gaza. In Lebanon, for more than 1 year, that was the case. In the case with Iran, after 9 days, the Israelis themselves requested a ceasefire. And the reason for that is that the Iranian missiles actually inflicted significant damage on the Israelis. And if you stop at this point, then you have achieved exactly the opposite of what Netanyahu sought to achieve. He was seeking dominance over Iran, and instead, he would be ending up creating a scenario in which he started a war and got out of that mutual deterrence. Both sides can deter the other, both sides can inflict damage on the other. And that is the opposite of what the Israelis were looking for. They were looking for subjugation. So while some people are looking at the mutual deterrence as a reason as to why there wouldn't be another war, my argument was that's precisely why there will be another war, because the Israeli military doctrine doesn't allow for any other country that is hostile to Israel, and Israel views essentially all countries either as hostile or subservient to the US, and as a result don't have the capacity to be hostile. But any country in the region that it deems to be hostile cannot be allowed to deter or infringe on Israel's total maneuverability. Iran currently does that, and that's precisely why the Israelis are likely to start a war again. What I wrote in the article is that the most likely window would be before the end of December, and that is because of the political calendar in the United States. Now, on December 29th, Netanyahu is going to come to this town, and once again, he's going to be pushing for war. And what that article pointed out, which also I think I had predicted in my piece, is that it would no longer be about the nuclear issue. The focus would shift towards the missiles. Partly because, of course, the missiles actually were effective, and the Israelis don't have to make up a challenge. But also because at the end of the day, until Iran is subjugated, the Israelis will find some other pretext for a war to drag the US into until they have achieved their objective. So even if the Iranians were to capitulate, for instance, in negotiations with the US on the nuclear issue, it doesn't matter because it doesn't end the conflict. It just shifts the conflict from nuclear to missiles. If they were to capitulate on missiles, well, then they have accepted complete domination. But even if they end up having something else, the Israelis would look at that as a new existential threat and use that as a pretext to start another war, which is then precisely why the Iranians won't capitulate, and you will end up having a very significant war if the Israelis started again.
And this shift from the centrality of the nuclear, Iranian nuclear program to, as you have written and many others have pointed to, the Iranian ballistic missile program, is it the result of the Iranian performance during the June conflict, or do you think this has always been the case, but Israel hasn't been able to find a legal or moral narrative around the missile system as opposed to the nuclear program?
No, I think the latter point you're pointing to is quite important. And I would point out there's no legal justification the Israelis have found. It was never, the centrality of the nuclear program was always the most effective way of getting the West to focus on Iran and seeking to start some sort of a military confrontation. It wasn't that the nuclear program itself was central, not trying to diminish the importance of it, but it was not central. What was central was if Iran had the ability to challenge Israel's domination. This is not about Israeli security. It's about securing Israeli dominion. And whether it is missiles, whether it is nukes, whether it's something else, the central goal has been to make sure that no country in the region can challenge that dominion. Now, if the Iranians were to build nuclear weapons, of course, that would be a challenge to it, but that's not what they were doing, and the Israelis knew that very well. In the public messaging that the Netanyahu government used, they said that they had to attack because they had intelligence that showed that Iran would build nuclear weapons in a couple of weeks or would have nuclear weapons in a couple of weeks. In the minutes from the internal cabinet meetings of the Israelis that were leaked, Netanyahu does not say a couple of weeks, he says a couple of years. Huge difference, because that means that it's not imminent, but also the Israelis have been saying since 1992 that Iran is a couple of years away from a nuclear weapon. So apparently nothing had changed. So this was entirely cooked up. There was no real justification for the war on the basis of any nuclear progress the Iranians had made. And if anything, the urgency was that the Iranians and the US may actually reach a nuclear deal based on the last proposal the Iranians were planning to present to the US on that Sunday, and the Israelis bombed on Friday. And that proposal was apparently quite attractive and may actually have been accepted by the US. And that may have been a key trigger for the Israelis to attack, not that the Iranians were actually close to building a bomb. So from the very outset, again, I'm not saying that these issues are not important, but they're pretexts for confrontation. And part of the reason why they're shifting it now away from the nuclear program is because Trump has declared that he obliterated the nuclear program. He specifically used this language to make sure the Israelis will not come back and use the nuclear angle as another reason to start a war, but he didn't quite figure out that the Israelis will just shift the goalpost to some other issue, which is exactly what they've done now.
And what is your reading about Trump's response to the Netanyahu proposal of restarting a war on Iran, given the split within the U.S. power holder or power broker? On one side are the Iran hawk, the Congress Republican caucus, people like Lindsey Graham, then the donor class, Miriam Edelson and others. We have Secretary of State Marco Rubio, quite an Iran hawk. And then the other camp would have people like Tucker Carlson. Um, uh, what is your sense of the balance between these two wings? Because that would be central to Trump's response to Netanyahu's proposal.
I think it is not the balance between those two sides that matter, but rather Trump's perception of that balance. And that's why it makes it so much more difficult to predict. I can tell you that my own impression is that the balance has clearly shifted in favor of Tucker Carlson, Steve Bannon, and many other voices who were against the first attack, but let that slide, but are certainly against any new attacks. It is also so that in the midst of all of this, of course, the other major agenda item is Gaza. And everyone's patience, even the friends of Netanyahu in the White House, are running out with his sabotage of the ceasefire. So he has major resistance on that issue as well. But on the other hand, as you pointed out, you have primarily major donors who are very supportive of Israel. and their voices. And the question is, how does Trump see this balance as he is now entering a midterm election that is likely to be very, very difficult for him? He didn't raise as much money as Kamala Harris did, but he beat her quite handsomely. Money is important, but it's not the only thing. The most important thing, particularly in this midterm election, is turnout. And turnout is going to be low on the Republican side because Trump himself is not on the ticket. So there's a lot of things that are working against Trump's favor on this issue. Pumping more money into it is not going to necessarily fix it. He actually needs to energize the base, get them to go out and vote. Being dragged into yet another war twice in his first term by Israel after having said that he's the peace president, the one that doesn't start wars. I personally think that's going to be really working to his detriment. But I don't know if that is how he perceives it. He perceived the idea of acquiescing to the Israelis in June as attractive and completely abandoning diplomacy. I thought that was a huge mistake, but that's how he perceived it. He still thinks that that is a major success for him, even though the nuclear issue is not resolved. And now, 6 months later, the Israelis are back knocking on his door asking, hey, we got another war we want to sell you.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about your thoughts on Israel-US relationship when it comes to question on Iran, because one side is what we just discussed, which views these divisions within the US administration or the perception about the balance of power between these two sides as critical in terms of the resultant of how the US, what decision the US takes. There is a different view, which is my reading is predominantly an Iranian view, which says that this is one large empire and these divisions are largely immaterial. The United States and Israel's interest in the region are very same. We might talk about some differences in terms of investment strategies, the infrastructure projects under the Abraham Accords, and so on and so forth. But when it comes to security, intelligence, military wing of the empire, it's one and the same. I wonder what your thoughts are about these two ways of looking at Israel-US relationship from an Iranian perspective.
Thank you. Yeah, I think you're quite right that the predominant view on the Iranian side is to look at Israel and the United States as two sides of the same coin, and that whatever differences may exist between them tend to be tactical, marginal, and at the end of the day, the US, acquiesces to Israeli desires, and what the Israelis do ultimately are in the US's interest. There is an element inside of the US in which this type of reading would be accurate about. A John Bolton or a neoconservative wing who, in the case of John Bolton, he doesn't even consider himself a neoconservative. He's just a neo-imperialist. And for them, Israel is a useful outpost in the Middle East. It's an extension of American power. It's an entity that amplifies American power. But for many others, and this has been not only a difference, but also a growing difference, is that the interests between the United States and Israel are actually diverging, and they have been diverging for some time. Part of the reason why we haven't seen this manifests itself as clearly in policy is because of the power of the pro-Israeli voices in Washington. But if the Iranian conception, and it's not entirely true that it's only Iranian, but if that other second conception is true, then we would never have had a JCPOA in the first place. There we saw the Obama administration really take on the pro-Israeli forces, take on the Israeli government, take on AIPAC and win. And then since then, of course, we've seen the Trump administration under his first term completely annihilate himself with the Netanyahu government, get rid of the JCPOA, allow the Israelis to annex Golan Heights, move the embassy, agree to this Abraham Accord, which is nothing but actually giving the Israelis everything they wanted and throwing the Palestinians under the bus, the US giving a bunch of concessions to other countries for them to recognize and normalize with Israel. What's in it for the US? So once you see things like that, clearly it's not difficult to draw the conclusion that perhaps they're just the same side of two sides of the same coin. But there's a different side to this. And look at what's happening right now. The only time the Netanyahu government has agreed to any ceasefire is because the Trump administration has threatened them with consequences if they don't. Now, the problem, of course, is that the Israelis agreed to it, but then very quickly start to negate it and violate it. And unless the US puts on prolonged and sustained pressure, the shift in Israeli policy will simply not be endurable. And this is part of the challenge of the Trump administration. Unlike Biden, they know how to put pressure on Israel and they know how to say no to Israel. Biden never did that. But Trump's attention span is not particularly long and he doesn't sustain the pressure. And the Israelis know it and they know exactly how to play with that type of situation. But I think it's very, very clear that the interests of the US and the Israelis are diverging. Look at the Trump national security strategy. It says that their interests in the Middle East will recede. This is the nightmare scenario for the Israelis. They've constantly fought that strain in American thinking, the strain that says the US should shift towards Asia. The Middle East is no longer that important. Why are we so overextended? This is something the Israelis have been fighting for the last 4 or 5 presidents. And the last 4 or 5 presidents have said the same thing, more or less, but not acted on it. Trump as well has said it, and he's put it in the NSS, but he's not acting on it because if he agrees to another war tomorrow or 2 days from now, when the Israeli Prime Minister is here as well, then once again, the administration is talking a big game about leaving the Middle East, but ultimately allowing itself to get pushed back in. But there is that difference. And the other thing that is really changing, that is crucial to understand in this, is that it's not just on the left now that there is a significant portion that have turned against Israel. That already happened 10, 15 years ago. The fusion between particularly the Black Lives Matter movement and the pro-Palestinian movement is very powerful on the left. This is the first time we see the manifestation of how things have shifted on the right, because people on the right now are turning quite dramatically against Israel, partly because of the way Israel is treating Christians in Palestine, but more than anything else, it's because this perception, which has been validated under the first 9 months of Trump now, or 12 months of Trump, which is that Israel is the country that is constantly pushing the United States into more wars. And the people on the right have turned dramatically against war for many different reasons, but the main one is they are the ones that are paying the cost for these wars. Where do American soldiers come from? They're not getting recruited out of Brooklyn or some of these other major blue districts. They're coming from Alabama, from Arkansas, from these red districts. And it's in those red districts that these soldiers are coming back, either in coffins or without limbs, with PTSD, coming home committing suicide, coming home not having a job. So they're the ones paying the cost for these endless wars. And that's part of the reason why you have such a dramatic shift in the anti-war direction amongst Republicans. And through Trump, that is now manifesting itself, even though I'm not saying that he's necessarily living up to it. But now you have a very strong anti-war movement on the right. And they have also then increasingly turned negative towards Israel because of Israel's role, crucial role, in constantly pushing the United States into wars in the Middle East.
And what is your sense of the Arab states in these conflicts? Because it seems to me that the Arab states, while they completely surrendered or they capitulated when it came to the question of Palestine, it seems to me that they don't want a hot war with Iran. Your take on how the Arab states must be negotiating in terms of this Israeli war on potential Israeli war on Iran.
The Arab states have grown increasingly worried about Israel, and I'm talking particularly about the GCC countries. And it's understandable that they have done so, not just because of the attack on Doha, and certainly not just because of what they have been doing in Gaza, the genocide in Gaza, but also because they saw under Biden that all restraints on Israel were lifted, and Israel got a complete carte blanche. And if you're sitting there, they must have started thinking, hold on, this could become really dangerous for the GCC countries. Because if the US is now completely unwilling to say no to Israel. I'm talking about the Biden years. What if the Israelis wanted to go after one of the GCC states, which is exactly then what happened when they bombed Gaza, as bombed Doha. And as one prominent GCC official said in a private setting, the GCC has learned how to manage their relationship and their contentions with Iran. And they managed to also collaborate with Iran at times. So this is a more complex relationship. They're not all fuzzy about Iran. They still see it as a threat, but they know how to manage it. How do they manage Israel when Israel has no constraints and the US is more or less only episodically willing to put constraints on Israel? So it's only natural for them to have that perception. This is why the Omani Foreign Minister Al Busaidi said at the Manama Dialogue earlier this year, in September or so, I think it was, that we have long known that the main force for destabilization in the region is not Iran, but Israel. So it's a huge statement because he didn't say that it's happening just now. He said, we have long known. Now, other states in the GCC may not come out and say so very explicitly, but it is my impression that that is an increasingly strong view in the GCC states. They don't want to see a war with Iran because they know that they will pay the price for the destabilization. Also, Iran has been weakened over the last course of the year and a half, and as a result, is not seen as big of a threat any longer. But Israel is seen as a threat. And I think it's important to understand that part of the reason why they came together, the Arab states, and pushed Trump for this, what ended up being called the Trump peace plan, was partly because of what was going on in Gaza, but it was really because the Gaza war was now spilling over into other states. And they were terrified that unless there was a change in the trajectory of Israel's behavior, which necessitated a change of trajectory in the US's approach to Israel, war would spread to their territory. So I think it's important when we take a look at how this is not ending up really benefiting the Palestinians, it's because it wasn't designed to. That was not its main course. Obviously, they wanted to see a ceasefire there. I think they're very disappointed that there isn't a real ceasefire, but they wanted something that more or less ended the slaughter in Gaza, not solve the issue, certainly not solve it in favor of the Palestinians. That's not how far they could go. They just needed a change in trajectory because otherwise their own security was really at risk.
Despite the GCC countries' suspicion about Israel, it seems to me that they have long thought that the U.S. can discipline Israel, and that's one of the reasons why I think that uh, they have always capitulated to the Israeli project in the larger region. Even during the 12-day conflict, I mean, there were prior to that conflict, we had been covering about how the GCC countries were worried about what Israel is doing because of what they did, what they were doing in Palestine and in Lebanon, and also bombing Syria. But at the final instance, they did nothing. In fact, they did many things. They supported the whole entourage of attack on Iran. One of the reasons is that they have relied on the United States, thinking that they would be able to discipline Israel. My question to you is: do you think, particularly after the 12-day war, do you think Israel can start a war on its own without U.S. Green signal?
So first of all, what you said, I think it's quite important. The GCC has relied on its relationship with the US to discipline and restrain Israel. Under Biden, this was completely unsuccessful, and there were deep frustrations. Under Trump, on at least two major occasions, it has been successful. And again, it's part of the reason why I think many of these states are quite silent and unforgiving, or quite forgiving of the fact that the Israelis are violating the ceasefire. Because at the end of the day, it is a lesser level of violence than it was before, and it changed its trajectory. And they're just so happy to see that Trump is susceptible to their pressure, whereas Biden was not. Is it enough? It clearly is not enough in any way, shape, or form. And privately, many of them themselves say that this is a disaster. But it was even more
You were
disastrous when
referring
we
to the
had an
cease. You were referring to the
the GCC,
ceasefire in
the
Iran and in
ceasefire and
Palestine.
the entire plan, the entire peace plan, that it is a terrible, terrible plan. but it was the one that was needed to change the trajectory of the US's approach towards Israel, which it did, at least momentarily. And now part of the reason why Netanyahu is back is to discuss that issue. And apparently, patience is running out in the White House, but whether they will actually pressure Israel once again to really go back to a real ceasefire remains to be seen. But on the second part of your question, can the Israelis start this on their own? I've spoken with former Israeli officials who were serving Netanyahu, who believe that from a military standpoint, this would be disastrous for the Israelis to do so. But that is something that Netanyahu nevertheless may do in order to start a war with the calculation that once war starts, it will become easier for him to drag the US into it. Particularly if there are major attacks by the Iranians, high casualty events on the Israeli side, and you have essentially a second mini October 7th, even though it was the Israelis that started the war, but that the Israelis would once again play that victim card and really strengthen the forces inside of the US that are in favor of Israel to pressure Trump to coming into that war, even though it's a war that Israel started without coordination with the US and probably with explicit American statements to Israel saying, we're not going to join you in this war. Once the war starts, Netanyahu may calculate that the dynamics will change in his favor. And this is part of the reason why a lot of Israelis are worried that not only will Netanyahu do so, but he will do so despite the fact that it will have significant cost for Israel itself. If you're sitting in Netanyahu's shoes, I think it's important to keep in mind in 10 or so months, there are going to be elections in Israel. These are not elections that he can postpone by continuing or starting another war. He's been able to postpone new elections in terms of his coalition falling apart through these wars and sustaining these wars. But the set elections he cannot change. And if he doesn't start a war with Iran before then, and also by then you have the midterm elections and things can change quite dramatically on the US side. If he doesn't start a war, then he will have accepted a new normal, and that new normal would be his legacy. And that new normal is mutual deterrence between Iran and Israel. So despite starting the war, despite inflicting significant damage on the Iranians, killing a very large number of their senior military officials and their nuclear scientists and another 1,000 Iranian civilians, and inflicting tremendous infrastructure damage as well, all he achieved was mutual deterrence, which is the exact opposite. So I think if you're sitting in his shoes, he is desperate to start a new war, with or without the US to start with, but his calculation is that he will drag the US into it once it has started.
I want to end with a couple of relatively broader question, and my first question is: uh, how much is the centrality of Palestine in terms of Iran-Israel relationship? We know it's a big part, but my question is it all about Iran's support of the resistance in Palestine? Is Israel's belligerence? Is Israel's intention to establish dominance, quote unquote, in the region? Is it only limited to its Greater Israel project and to the extent Iran is a deterrent against it? Or is it, does it go beyond Palestine and does it cover a region that spills into the Persian Gulf and beyond?
I would actually say that it's not even secondary, perhaps a third-rate issue in all of this, not a big part of this relationship at all. If it was central, then you would have had a very different situation in the 1980s when the Iranians were actually much more aggressive in their rhetoric against Israel and much more aggressive in supporting certain groups on the Palestinian side. But that's the time when the Israelis were actually pushing the US to make friends with Iran, sell weapons to Iran, and not pay attention to a lot of the rhetoric that came out of Iran. What you see is in the 1990s, that's when things get really harsh between Iran and Israel. And it's not because of Iran's support for the Palestinians. That actually intensified afterwards It's because of a new geopolitical situation in which the Israelis were quite afraid that Iran would emerge as the new major power in the region. They would make friends with the United States, and the US would lose Israel as a pivotal nation in the region because out of the Cold War context, what really was the strategic value add of Israel to the United States? This is the moment also in which the Israelis shift their language. They used to be talking about how strategically important they were to the US as an outpost of um, um, of the Western side in the Middle East, pushing back against Soviet penetration of the Middle East. After 1992, however, when there was no Soviet Union to point to as a justification for this relationship, that's when the Israelis started to talk about how the basis of the Israeli-American relationship are these mutual values between the two states. This is not a term you even heard in the 1980s, but in the absence of any strategic reason for it, they shifted the language to talk about that these are two states that are just so intertwined in their values, and that is the basis of their relationship. But they were afraid that that would collapse if the United States made friends with Iran, which at the time the Iranians were trying quite hard to make up with the US. At this point, I mean, take a look at what happened during the JCPOA negotiations. The Rouhani government stayed silent, more or less, on the Palestinian issue, said almost nothing about Israel. When the Israelis attacked Gaza in 2014, the Iranian profile was very, very low compared to profile of it with 2009. It made no difference. The Israelis were as aggressive as you could imagine because the big threat was not Iran's position on Israel and Palestine. Not to say that it was minor, but it wasn't a big threat. What was the big threat was that the US and Iran may actually end their enmity and bury the hatchet. That was what the Israelis were dramatically working against, and it's because of what they call their fear of abandonment. In their view, if Iran and the United States made friends, the US-Iran tensions would recede significantly. It wouldn't turn into a love fest. And then the US would have a much easier time leaving the Middle East and shifting its focus to Asia. And from the Israeli perspective, they asked themselves a crucial question. If the US and Iran more or less make friends and the US leaves the region, will that reduction in Iranian and American tension be accompanied with a proportionate reduction in Israeli-Iranian tensions? And their answer was no. Now, I think they're quite incorrect there, but nevertheless, they thought no. Iran and Israel's rivalry will remain, but now the Israelis will no longer have a US that automatically sides with Iran because the US will shift its focus towards Asia. And as a result, Israel would be abandoned facing a hostile Iran. So however you look at this, the Palestinian issue is more of a public justification at times, more of a tool that the Iranians use to rally support against Israel, rally around their own leadership of the Muslim world, but not the core issue. And in fact, take a look at Iran's profile for the last 2 years when it comes to what the Israelis are doing in Gaza. Sure, they have been more vocal than many of the Arab states in this, but that's a very low bar given how badly those Arab states have performed. But the Iranians have constantly worked to de-escalate the situation and prevent the war from spreading beyond Gaza. This is why they were constantly telling Hezbollah not to attack Israel, because they didn't want to see that be used as a pretext for the Israelis expanding the war. Now, the Iranians completely failed because Israel has bombed 7 countries in the last 2 years and has expanded the war also into Iranian territory. But if the Iranians were really there for the Palestinian issue alone, and this was so central to them, their conduct would have been much, much more different. They would perhaps have done what the Hamas thought or hoped that they would do, which is that once Hamas started the war with Israel on October 7th, Hezbollah and Iran would automatically join in. Neither of them did that.
Yeah, I hear your point on this. I have often thought about this question in multiple occasions about when the entire Western imperial system is directed at a third country like Iran. How much of it is a moral question to ask whether Iran did enough, to the extent it did? How much of is it? How much of is it a correct question to ask that Iran didn't do enough to save or in solidarity with the Palestinians when the Israeli Americans were conducting genocide in Gaza?
Well, I mean, what you're pointing to, again, I think is quite correct. What you're pointing to is that at the end of the day, the Iranians are looking out for their own national interest. That doesn't mean that the Palestinian cause is irrelevant, but it is not the central piece of what is motivating them to act, which is quite natural. It is not the central piece for any other country. There's no country that is actually fully sacrificing themselves for the Palestinians. If they were, the Palestinians would have had a state by now, arguably. Have the Iranians done more than most Arab states? Many of the Iranians would argue that. I was moderating a panel with former Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif at the Doha Forum, and he very strongly made the case that the Iranians have done far more than many of these Arab states, in fact, all of the Arab states in his argument. And this is part of the reason why he is sanctioned by the United States personally. Whereas you don't have a lot of Arab officials, if any at all, that are being sanctioned for it. And I think it is fair to say that they have done a lot, but I don't think those things were done out of charity for the Palestinians. They were done because and this is where I probably disagree with Dr. Zarif. This were done because the Iranians at the time, at least, viewed it as being in their own national interest, as part of their own rivalry with the Israelis, to support the Palestinians, as it was one of the instruments that they needed against the Israelis. And I think this is, again, the tragedy of the Palestinians, even when they have been supported. And right now, there's a lot of rhetoric coming out of Turkey that they're so supportive of Palestine. And on a public level in Turkey, of course, public opinion is very strongly in favor of the Palestinians. And in their view, the Turkish officials adamantly tell me how much they've done for the Palestinians. And they have done some, there's no doubt about that. But it's also very clear that it is, at the end of the day, about Turkey for the Turks. And that is not an abnormal situation. That is a totally normal situation. And right now, you're going to see more tensions between Israel and Turkey. And it is not because of Gaza. It is because of Syria. It's because how Turkey and Israel are encroaching each other's what has now been new established spheres of influence. And their rivalry is going to play out, not just in Syria, but in Somaliland, in the Horn of Africa, with the Israelis just recognizing, the only country recognizing Somaliland as an independent country. An area in which the Turks have been quite active. It is part of their crucial, they have a base there in the Horn of Africa, which is crucial for their Africa policy. So you're seeing these geopolitical rivalries playing out in several different areas. Did the Israelis recognize Somaliland because of their sympathy with Somaliland? Or did they do so because of the larger geopolitical calculation they have in their larger competition, which now increasingly is vis-a-vis Turkey as well as vis-a-vis Iran?
My final question about the narrative, and this involves Western media's narrative on Iran. We have seen a significant shift in public opinion in the West when it comes to the question of Israel and Palestine, particularly because of the live stream genocide they did. Of course, the mainstream legacy media has been complicit in the genocide, as they have been complicit in cooking up narratives against Iran. But my question to you is, when it comes to Western narratives on Iran, it seems to me that not much has changed. To some extent, maybe yes, but not to the extent that it has happened in Palestine, for various reasons. One is about the campus protest and the centrality of the Palestinian cause that has spread within American campuses. As a scholar on Iran, what's your sense of Western public opinion about regarding Iran?
So the shift has occurred on Palestine, no doubt, particularly amongst younger Americans. I've not seen any opinion polls that has connected this to other states in the region, meaning has their view on Iran, on Qatar, on Turkey shifted in any particular direction in any significant way as a corollary to their shift of opinion on Palestine and Israel. It would be very interesting to see if that has happened. I would suspect that amongst younger people, there may be a bit of that, but certainly not in the way that those countries that have championed the Palestinian cause have benefited greatly in the manner in which the young people in the United States or Europe have been looking, have changed the way that they're looking at Israel-Palestine. If it is there, I would still suspect that it's not very significant. But again, I'm just speculating here because I've not seen any polls, and I think it would be very interesting to do such a poll. In general, the narrative on Iran has actually only hardened because the media and the government narratives have grown more pro-Israel, and as a result, more anti-Iran as well. I mean, you had the German chancellor say that Israel's and America's attack on Iran, he said that Israel is doing Europe's dirty work Israel's doing Europe's dirty work by bombing Iran. I mean, we're talking about a case in which the Israelis started a war illegally, and they also broke the Geneva Convention by attacking nuclear sites. And all of this is happening between the fifth and the sixth rounds of negotiations. So not just failing to condemn a clear violation of international law, but actually embracing it and justifying it. And to a very large extent, this is because as Gaza intensified, Germany in particular just became an annex of Israeli narratives, a vassal, but also because of Iran's role in supporting Russia against Ukraine, which prior to that had already really poisoned the relationship between Europe and Iran. So on the state and the media narrative, it's become even more aggressive and negative than it was before, to the point that the Germans, who of course condemned it when the Russians attacked Ukrainian nuclear facilities and really relied on international law, then now completely set it aside and even embraced a war when the Israelis were starting it. So on the one hand, you have that. On the other hand, you have the situation in which Iran's support for Russia already had made things so much worse. But is the gap between the public's view of Iran and the government narrative's view of Iran, is the delta as large as it is on Palestine? Not at all. I would say that the delta is much, much smaller, and it may have grown a bit because of Palestine as a secondary effect, but I would suspect that it hasn't grown that much.
I guess part of the reason is also maybe a small part. I don't know how small or big, but part of the reason is also the kind of liberal left, their view on Iran is extremely negative. Their view on Palestine, they may still take the framework of Netanyahu as far right is the problem in Israel and not the whole Zionist project. They would not concede Hamas or any part of the resistance as a genuine anti-colonial project, but nevertheless they do support a slice of the Palestinian resistance and anti-colonial and liberation project, while on Iran they are so much hooked to liberal feminist projects, liberal notions of democracy, elections, on religion, and so on and so forth, that their view on Iran becomes extremely negative. So you have this quote unquote left liberal project whose view on Iran is like intolerable, while these are the same people who would be anti-Israel, not necessarily in the sense that we are, but in other ways.
So I think first we do have to recognize, look, what the Iranian regime is doing against the Iranian people and the repression of women is a real thing. And naturally that will lead to a lot of opposition and resentment, particularly in certain parts of the left. So you're quite right about that. I think the bigger problem there is the manner in which certain politicians in particular, and they have been quite influential, are using that, not for the sake of actually standing up for women or standing up for the Iranian people, but they're using that as part of the larger pro-Israel project that they have. And this is particularly true when it comes to certain German voices on this issue. The very same people who are banging their fists on the desk when it comes to human rights in Iran, the rights of women in Iran, are at the same time going out of their way to justify a genocide in Palestine. So any moral standing that they claim to have is completely a fantasy. And they have been quite influential on large parts of the European left and influencing the perceptions on Iran in general. But I think for the perception on Iran to change dramatically, it will also require for Iran to change quite dramatically. Now, there's changes that are taking place here, for instance. In many ways, the Masa Amini projects or demonstrations that were led by the people inside of Iran were actually quite successful because you have a huge cultural shift in Iran right now. The government doesn't even dare to try to impose hijab any longer. They're not picking that fight any longer because also there wasn't any support amongst Iranian conservatives for that. A majority of Iranian conservatives supported the hijab but did not support mandatory hijab. And they saw this overreaction and this terrible repression as something that only weakened Iran's geopolitical situation, both because of the tensions between society and government, but also because of the manner in which certain voices, many of them on the liberal left, took advantage of that in order to further escalate tensions or pressure on Iran. So you have that element. But again, I think, we're seeing a situation in which, in my view, much of the liberal left right now is kind of lost. They put so much of their eggs in the idea that, you have to defeat Russia and that NATO expansion had nothing to do with the war. And that's come back to completely explode in their face because NATO expansion certainly had something to do with the war. In fact, it had quite a lot to do with the war. It's not the only factor. You have Amanda Sloat, the NSC director for Europe for Biden, who inadvertently totally admitted this when she thought that she was speaking to some Ukrainians that actually were Russians pretending to be Ukrainians, and it's all over the internet right now. But they put so much of their eggs in that basket, and by that abandoned their anti-war credentials that they had built up opposing Afghanistan, opposing Iraq war, etc. Because now suddenly they have found the good war. And it turns out that it wasn't a good war. It was another war that could have been completely avoided had the West taken a much more reasonable position in the negotiations. Because NATO membership for Ukraine was never in the cards. It was always an illusion. NATO was never going to let Ukraine into. So the only thing that they were essentially defending was the concept, not the actual membership, but the concept that Ukraine could join membership, join NATO. And for that, we've now had 4 years of war, total devastation, more than 300,000 people dead. And for what? So I think there's a huge crisis on the liberal left, and they're going to have a hard time finding their moral standing again, and even harder time finding their strategic standing again, because they've ended up being wrong on that issue. And on Palestine, they were dragged to that position by their progressive wing, at least as I'm talking about the American context. They didn't go to that themselves. They were dragged to it. And even then, we saw under the Biden administration that the progressive wing did not have the power to be able to force change of policy on Biden. In fact, not only under Biden, but also during the DNC and during the election, they pushed those voices out and they lost the election as a result of that. That was the key reason as to why more than 19 million voters who had voted for Biden in 2020 did not show up in 2024. They stayed home. They didn't vote at all. They didn't vote for Trump. They didn't vote for Jill Stein. They just stayed home. And 29% of them, the plurality said they did so because of Biden's Gaza policy and the DNC's Gaza policy. And that's, again, the very same liberal left who also claim such moral high ground because of the position they took on Ukraine, which turned out to be not moral at all.
We'll leave it there, Dr. Parsi. This was a wonderful conversation, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. I'll send you the link once we upload it tomorrow.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.